Rome reached its apogee during the early and High Empire. During this time, Rome's dominion extended from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, and from northern Britain to Upper Egypt. Although Rome had been born in blood and maintained the greatest army in the world at the time, the empire enjoyed many decades of unprecedented peace and prosperity. In this lecture, we will survey the early and high imperial periods, covering in broad strokes Rome's rulers from Augustus to Elagabalus. As we shall see, while Augustus's arrangements worked well for a given time, by the start of the 3rd century, the secret of empire, namely that Rome was a military dictatorship, was apparent to all. Before we get started talking about the Roman Empire, I would first like to address one of the most common narratives about the transition from the Republic to the Empire. There is a pretty common narrative, especially in popular histories, about how the death of the Republic was this great loss for liberty, how freedom and democracy went out the window and were replaced by tyranny. The problem with that narrative is, as we've seen, that the Republic was not very democratic, and it didn't really represent freedom in any meaningful way for the overwhelming majority of Romans. So even though the elections are now rigged and there are no meaningful choices to be made in politics, for most Romans, that is not a change from what they had before. In the Republican elections, you would have 35 tribes voting, but the first 18 tribes who would vote would be composed almost entirely of wealthy voters. So if the rich were for a certain candidate, then that candidate would be elected regardless of what the majority of the population thought. And those tribes got to vote first, and if they reached a majority by all 18 voting for the same candidate, then the election ended right there, and poor people who had stood there all day waiting to vote had to go home without having their voices heard. And that's just one example of how there wasn't really all that much freedom in the Roman Republic. Another example is how all of the court cases that actually went through the court system were about rich people. If you weren't wealthy, you never went to court in the ancient world. So all of the institutions of the Roman Republic only really worked for rich people. In terms of who lost their liberty when the Republic fell, the answer is a few thousand people. So basically, the political class went from a few thousand people, so the 600 senators and their biggest supporters, some of the more wealthy people who are not quite in the Senate, it went from that to the emperor, his family, and his closest friends, so a circle of perhaps a couple hundred people. There really wasn't that big of a change for the majority of people, especially if they didn't live in Rome proper. So there wasn't much liberty to lose, frankly. So this narrative that gets repeated constantly is something that really should be retired. Because if you understand how Roman politics works, it doesn't make any sense at all. We also see that there's very little evidence that most Romans mourn the passing of the Republic in any way. We also see that Roman legionaries, who were common Romans, eagerly followed their generals into battle. So they did not think that the Republic was some great bastion that defended their rights. At least most of them didn't feel that way. Where does this narrative come from then, this narrative of the loss of liberty? Well, it comes from elite Romans living in the early empire who would pine for the days when their ancestors, or at least their predecessors, because as we've mentioned, many of the old senatorial families had died out during the Civil War period. They would pine for the days when they ruled and made decisions. But as we'll see, they never really did anything with those sentiments. They followed the emperors of their day dutifully, and most of them prospered under the system the same as anyone else. So they didn't even lose that much to begin with. But the notion that the Roman Republic's fall was some great loss for representative government really assumes something that isn't true, namely that the Republic was ever very representative to begin with. Last time we discussed Augustus's settlement in 27 BCE. This was a significant date for Roman history, since it was from this date all the way forward to 180 CE, a period of over 200 years, when Rome would enjoy what has come to be known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. For the most part during this time, despite some wars here and there and an occasional civil war, the Roman world was at peace and was enjoying ever-increasing prosperity. The population was steadily growing, and from the foundation of the empire until its peak, the population, we think, grew from about 60 million to 100 million, which is a pretty substantial increase. It nearly doubled due to the peace and prosperity brought about by Augustus and his heirs. The Roman Empire also enjoyed more wealth per person than had been the case before the rise of the empire. Material prosperity increased across the board, not just for the wealthy, but for everyone. One way to track that is to look at average heights, especially the average height of women. And we see that consistently throughout Rome's domains, that the average height of women increased by a few inches, or sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. And what this indicates is that nutrition improved. People had access to more and better food. Life expectancy increased. We see lots and lots of signs that the Roman Empire brought material comfort to people in a way that the Republic and the previous governments had not. Rome also invested heavily in infrastructure. They built roads, bridges, and aqueducts which connected and watered large swaths of Europe, Asia, and Africa. So this was not a bad period to live if you were just a common person eking out a living. And of course, it doesn't compare very well with, say, the modern period in terms of amenities or quality of life, but compared to almost any other pre-modern period, this was quite a good time to be alive. In his own time, Augustus tried to leave his stamp on Rome and its culture, and he succeeded. In Rome itself, his best friend Agrippa built the Pantheon, which was one of the most impressive buildings in Rome, and something that has endured to this very day. In terms of culture, however, Augustus wanted to cultivate a number of talented writers and let them reshape Rome's culture. One of the people he turned to was the poet Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid. The Aeneid is effectively a sequel to the Greek Iliad and Odyssey. And the Aeneid takes up the story of one of the Trojan princes, Aeneas, from the Iliad, and tells how he escaped from Troy and went on to settle in Italy. The Romans now claimed him as an ancestor, so they claimed to be not only the descendants of the local Italians, but also of the Trojans. And so this made them a little bit more special. And Virgil's Aeneid was actually technically not finished, and the version that we have of it now is a draft, believe it or not. Virgil had ordered it to be burned upon his death since he didn't have time to fully edit the entire thing, but Augustus countermanded that request, and that is why we still have the Aeneid today. Horace and Ovid were also very prominent poets in this period, and the three of them often interacted with one another. The historian Livy wrote a complete history of Rome from its foundation, and he was another person who was writing under the auspices of Augustus. While the entirety of Livy's work has not survived, many pieces of it have, including his account of the Second Punic War, which is considered a classic, and also his account of Rome's earliest history, which was largely an invention of this period, when the Romans are trying to come up with a suitably elevated, deep history for themselves. At the same time, while Augustus was working on the level of high culture, he was also interested in preserving Rome's great old families from the Republic. And one way they tried to do this was to instill family values by passing bills against adultery and by penalizing people who chose not to have children. However, it's worth noting his bill against adultery only punished the women. Men were free to do as they pleased. And ultimately, his own daughter fell afoul of this law, as she was known to be promiscuous, and she ended up getting exiled for it. Ultimately, Augustus's attempts to instill more family values failed, and many wealthy Romans chose not to have children because they thought it would be an inconvenience. So many families at this time did end up dying out. And in fact, by the end of the Julio-Claudian Dynasty, only a handful of the old patrician families from the Republic's early years were still around. Early in the Second Triumvirate, Augustus met and fell madly in love with a young woman named Livia. She was already married and had 2 children, but Augustus had to have her, so he forced her to get divorced, and the 2 of them married. They stayed together for the rest of their lives and apparently were a genuine love connection. Despite the fact that both of them met while they were in their 20s and both of them were clearly able to have children, they never had children together. But because both of them did have children from their previous marriages, those children combined to form the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. The Julio-Claudians were an interesting group of people, and they also were a family marred by a great deal of tragedy. Most of the young men who should have grown up to be in contention for being emperor died under mysterious circumstances. Many of them were probably murdered. Others of them seem to have suffered from health problems or they were killed in battle. So we'll see that the succession after Augustus is relatively unpredictable. You could never have guessed 10 years out who would have been the one to be chosen in the family to be the next emperor. So when Augustus died, he had outlived all of his grandsons, and he had to choose his stepson, Tiberius. Tiberius was the obvious choice. He was in his 50s. He had been a highly competent administrator and soldier under his stepdad, and although the 2 of them didn't like each other, Augustus did recognize that Tiberius had talent. Tiberius did a pretty good job in the first half of his reign, up to about 26 or so, but at that point he himself was getting older, and also his more introverted tendencies were really kicking in. He didn't enjoy being in the center of attention at Rome, so he actually sort of pioneered remote work, and he governed by correspondence. So he would get mail from Rome and then send mail back. At a certain point, he became more paranoid, however, and he began to institute treason trials in Rome. So the Senate was in terror, and this is also a time when some of those old families were exterminated because they were suspected of treason. So Tiberius was a pretty mixed bag. His heir ended up being his great-nephew Caligula, also known as Gaius. He was called Caligula, which means little boots, because as a child his own father had taken him into legionary camps and paraded him around dressed as a soldier. Caligula was not prepared for office. He was very young. He was in his 20s. He had no idea how to govern. He had no military experience. And because of Tiberius's paranoia, he had not been introduced into public life, even though it was fairly obvious for several years that he was the only real option to be the next emperor. So when he came in, he didn't really know what to do. He started behaving arrogantly, and the Senate considered him to be insane. He gets murdered in the year 41, and he is succeeded by his uncle Claudius. Claudius was chosen by the Praetorian Guard and elevated to be emperor. Originally, Augustus had ruled Claudius out as someone who could partake in politics. Claudius had a bit of a limp, and he also tended to drool. So he had some very minor physical disabilities, but in this period that was considered disqualifying because it was seen as a sign of disfavor directly from the gods. So Claudius was essentially seen as unlucky and cursed. However, once he got into power, Claudius proved to be pretty competent. He was a good administrator, he was good at getting along with the Senate, and he also did some administrative reforms. He oversaw the conquest of Britain, so Rome added a major territory for the first time in the imperial period. However, Claudius married his niece, Agrippina the Younger, who was very ambitious, and she was determined to make sure that her son from a previous relationship, Nero, would become the next emperor. So she murdered her husband Claudius and also made sure that his son Britannicus didn't live to adulthood. Nero came to power due to the scheming of his mother. For the first several years, the teenager, Nero was about 17 when he came to power, didn't really care about governing. He was obsessed with singing and chariot races. And he certainly thought of himself as Rome's greatest entertainer. When he would be introduced to the people, he would always come out in the guise of a chariot racer or a great singer or in some other way. Eventually, he tired of his mother and his advisors and got rid of them. He had some really harebrained schemes to try to kill his mom. It took a really long time, but he eventually pulled it off. And ultimately, while the empire did well under Nero, the ruling class hated him because they thought of him as incompetent, erratic, and frankly a joke. Nero would make them sit and attend his singing performances, and apparently he did not have a very good singing voice. When he learned that there was a revolt against him, he panicked, and rather than calling the troops to defend him, which he could have done, the troops were actually still pretty loyal to Nero, instead he committed suicide and then proclaimed as he was dying, "What an artist dies in me." He could have also said, "What a dynasty dies in me," because he was the last of the Julio-Claudians, as he died without an heir. With the great artist Nero dead, the empire was now up for grabs. 4 generals, all of whom had active commands at the time, took their armies and vied for control. The year 69 is also known as the Year of the 4 Emperors. By late 69 CE, Vespasian had prevailed over his rivals. He went on to found the Flavian Dynasty. He himself ruled from 69 to 79, and then he was succeeded first by his eldest son Titus, who ruled from 79 to 81, and then by Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96, until he was murdered. A generation later, Tacitus, who had come of age during the Flavian period, wrote about the events of 69, and he said that what was revealed was the secret of empire. In his words, this was namely that emperors can be made elsewhere other than in Rome. But what he means by that is that Rome's legions were the source of the emperor's power, not the Senate. I.e., the Republic was dead, and Rome had become a military dictatorship. All of the Republican trappings which still exist were merely that, trappings, forms. In reality, the legions were the electors of Rome. And I think you can even make a case that the example of Claudius shows this as well. The Senate did not vote for Claudius. The Praetorian Guard simply marched with him to the Senate house and told them that Claudius was the new emperor and that they should vote to confirm him. But we'll go with Tacitus for this because I think that he makes a compelling case. And the phrase secret of empire has really stuck and does a great deal to explain exactly how the Roman Empire worked. For several generations, the Romans had enjoyed public entertainments. These had started out on a fairly modest scale. Say someone would walk off a street and hold a gladiator contest or something like that in order to honor an ancestor at a funeral. But over time, these had become grander and grander. And by the time of the empire, the scale of these entertainments was increasing by quite a bit. Rome already had a great structure for holding chariot races, the Circus Maximus, but otherwise it was a little bit limited in terms of venues to hold grand entertainment. The Flavians set out to change that. Vespasian commissioned the Colosseum early in his reign, and by the year 80, when his son Titus was in power, the Colosseum opened for the first time and went on to become perhaps the most iconic structure in Roman history. We don't know the exact seating capacity of the Colosseum, but we're thinking that it held about 80,000 people at its peak. The facility was very flexible. You could do a whole lot with the space that you had there, and there were also holding tanks and other things under the stage which enabled a variety of entertainments to be put on. It was big enough to do chariot racing, although as I said, there was already a specialized venue for that. Plays could be performed at the Colosseum. You could have gladiator fights. Gladiator fights were incredibly popular, and the popularity had not been diminished by the Spartacus revolt. Animal fights, where criminals were fed to lions and other wild animals, were common. And The structure was actually sophisticated enough that you could pump water into it, flood it, and then put boats on it and fight mock naval battles. So the Colosseum was an incredible structure, and you could go there and for a very low price see world-class entertainment with cutting-edge technology for the day. In fact, the technology of the Colosseum as an entertainment complex was not really surpassed until about the 1950s. One of the other features that it had was a big awning that could be retracted over the people there to create shade, but also opened up to let the sun in. So, I mean, this was an incredible structure and one of the real highlights of the Flavian Dynasty. For the Romans, the Bay of Naples was considered to be one of the greatest resort areas in the world. It was a rich, fertile place, and it was in the shadow of this beautiful mountain called Mount Vesuvius. The Romans don't seem to have really understood until the eruption that Mount Vesuvius was an active and very dangerous volcano. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted, and it buried two resort towns at Pompeii and Herculaneum. These towns were completely taken by surprise, and it appears that the vast majority of the residents did not take the time to evacuate. There were some warnings that something was about to happen in terms of tremors and the mountain smoking, but let's face it, the ancient world did not have a clear understanding of volcanology. The result, however, has been invaluable for scholars. Both of these towns are well preserved, and modern archaeologists have a veritable treasure trove in both of them. We find that the buildings there are preserved more or less exactly as they were in 79. Graffiti is still on the walls. We can see political slogans from local candidates. We can see graffiti about so-and-so was here. We can see prices listed. We can see men bragging about prostitutes that they visited and things like that in terms of graffiti. We also see people's bodies preserved in the positions they were holding when they died. So we see people in terror. We get a good sense of how big people were, what they looked like. A lot of the jars and vases were preserved, so we get a good sense of what people were storing, how many vases might be in a typical home or storage area. There's all kinds of information we can glean from this. So the horrible tragedy that befell these two resort towns has been for scholars an absolute blessing. But anyway, this is something that really gives us a good picture of daily life for the Romans. Although, to be fair, neither of these towns is terribly typical of a Roman settlement. As I've mentioned, both of them are resort towns, so they have a much wealthier clientele than most, and also they are full of many brothels, much more so than your average Roman town. But still, this is a slice of life that got preserved, and this is something that you really should look at very closely if you're interested in the daily lives of Romans in the first century. The prosperity of the Roman Empire meant that not only did cities grow quite a bit, but also that they increased in terms of their beauty and sophistication. Even cities in places as far afield as Western Africa now had bathhouses and theaters. These were fairly common things for any Roman city of any size. So the Roman world was sharing in prosperity fairly broadly. Many times these structures would actually be built by local elites who wanted to get credit and really ingratiate themselves with the locals. Other times, though, these buildings were built when the Romans themselves would send money in order to keep the favor of the local populace. Sometimes the emperors would send it as largesse. Rome itself grew to about 1.5 to 2 million people at its peak. And it also became filled with grand architecture. Most of the surviving monuments that we see today in ruins were actually built during this period rather than in an earlier period. Many of the great temples of the Republic were rebuilt in better materials, and also a lot of the greater monuments, such as Trajan's Column, were constructed at this time as well. In the East, cities retained their distinctive identity, especially if those cities happen to be Greek, But they also shared in the Pax Romana, and some of their structures were commissioned by the Romans. The Romans would go there and give them money to renovate structures or to build new temples and new libraries and things of that nature. So all of the cities of the empire benefited immensely from Rome's prosperity. Another thing to keep in mind is that not only was Rome helping cities on the interior, but the military bases that had established on the frontiers of Rome on the Danube and the Rhine and in Syria grew up into modern cities, and many of those have survived to the present. Just a few examples of places that are still inhabited and are still fairly major population centers. In France, you have Strasbourg. In Germany, there's the city of Mainz. Both of those are along the Rhine River, and both have over 200,000 people today. In Spain, Barcelona was a Roman foundation. And in England, the Romans founded a little place called Londinium, which of course became London. So Roman prosperity was spread far and wide across the entire extent of their empire, and its cities really benefited the most. That's actually where we have the greatest evidence for the kind of prosperity that Rome was enjoying as a whole, is by looking at the various cities around the empire and charting their growth. Although the Roman emperors spent lavishly on beautiful temples for the traditional gods, during this period, and especially as we move into the High Empire, the traditional religion of Rome was starting to lose a little bit of ground with common people. Many people were now looking for a somewhat more personal religious experience. In Rome, it was possible to worship as many gods as you wanted so long as you paid attention to the traditional gods of Rome and were willing to perform sacrifices for the emperor's health. So this meant that many Romans had the freedom to experiment religiously, and many of them took that up. This led to the rise of what are known as mystery cults. A mystery cult is where you get inducted into a religion, and as you go along you learn new secrets, and eventually you learn a secret which will help you in some way, either by giving you wisdom or by helping you to get some sort of an afterlife. Many mystery cults rose and fell during this period, but there are three that stand out and need to be discussed. The first is the cult of Isis. Isis was actually an Egyptian goddess dating back to ancient Egypt. So the earliest mentions of Isis go back to about the time of the earliest Egyptian civilization. This is a very ancient goddess. However, her worship had evolved a great deal over the millennia, and part of her appeal, of course, was her antiquity. Eventually, though, it evolved into a mystery cult where Isis would offer salvation and an afterlife to anyone who believed in her. Here you see an actual statue of Isis from this period, and you can see that she actually looks a whole lot like a Greek goddess in this one, but she's wearing a black robe. By this point, Isis had been heavily Hellenized, and she would even be a bit Romanized once she moved west. This cult was actually extremely popular and was widespread, especially among the lower classes. Another really popular cult was the cult of Mithras. This cult was a little more limited in its appeal, but the people who worshiped Mithras tended to be rather powerful in Roman society. The cult of Mithras was about warriors, and so this really took off within the Roman legions. And in fact, the cult of Mithras was prominent with the legions from the 1st until the 4th century CE. It was easily the majority religion in the legions for that entire period. Another mystery cult was Christianity. Christianity had started life as an offshoot of Judaism, and it grew slowly in the cities of Rome, but only became prominent around 300 or so CE. So for now we won't talk too much about it, but the mystery of Christianity, of course, is merely discovering that it is possible to gain an afterlife. So these are all things which qualify as mystery cults, and we see that during this period there was a big market for mystery cults that catered to individuals, and especially that were aimed at offering some kind of an afterlife. During the 18th century, the British historian Edward Gibbon wrote a history of the Roman Empire where he labeled the 5 men who ruled the empire between 96 and 180 the 5 good emperors. This is an old school, but I think accurate label for those 5 men. What makes them stand out from the rest of the Roman emperors is that they never seized power through military means, and they also did not pass on the throne to their biological sons. Rather, these were all 5 unrelated men who adopted a qualified person to be their heir when they died. And this meant that there were neither civil wars nor incompetent heirs coming to power. And that's a large part of why the Roman Empire during this period really reached its apogee. In fact, it's safe to say that if you had to choose any particular period of Roman history to live in, it would definitely be at some point between 96 and 180, preferably before about 160 due to some events we'll really get into in a bit. But just to give a brief outline of these 5 men, the first one was an elderly senator named Nerva. There was a power vacuum after Domitian's death, and the Senate elected Nerva. He wasn't very secure in his position because he had been elected by the Senate, and of course the Senate had no troops backing them. Nerva knew that he needed a support for his reign, and he also knew that because he was old and sickly, once he died, the generals would simply fight a civil war. So to forestall all of that, he adopted Trajan. Trajan at this time was Rome's best general, and he had the largest army, so Nerva figured reasonably that he would win the civil war once it happened, so he just adopted Trajan as his son. He ended up living a little longer than expected, and then he died. Trajan became emperor. Trajan would rule for about 20 years, and when he was growing ill, he adopted his cousin Hadrian. Hadrian would then come to power. He was already experienced. He ruled for 20 years himself, and eventually, as he became ill, he started looking around for potential heirs, and he had settled upon an accomplished general, but that guy ended up dying before him, so he was forced to turn to a virtuous senator named Antoninus Pius, and he also had Antoninus adopt a son himself to set up an extended line of succession. And Antoninus Pius adopted Marcus Aurelius and another man we don't need to name here because he's not that relevant. Antoninus Pius ruled at probably the most peaceful moment of Roman history. There's one account of him that says that he never came within 50 miles of a military base while emperor, and he never left Italy while he was in power. Marcus Aurelius came to power in 161. He ruled first with his stepbrother for several years, then the stepbrother died and Marcus kept going. He was known for being a philosopher and for being wise. However, despite all of the success that Roman had by adopting men who were qualified, Marcus actually broke the chain because he was married and he had a biological son named Commodus, who turned out to be an absolutely terrible emperor. And that is how the 5 good emperors came into being and how they ended. Before we move on, I'd like to say more about the emperors Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, since their reigns are pretty significant. Trajan was easily the greatest conqueror of the emperors. He was an almost purely military figure, and he also was an extremely talented soldier. His best-known work was the conquest of Dacia. During his time, Dacia, which was a new kingdom to the north of the Danube and was today Romania, was a rising power. And for the most part, the Romans were not comfortable with other powers existing. They preferred their frontier barbarians to be disparate and disorganized. So Trajan led an expensive and immensely complicated campaign against them. He had to tunnel through the mountains and also invade over the Danube River. This campaign was long, hard, but it did succeed. And it was perhaps one of the greatest proofs of Rome's engineering prowess. In the east, Trajan also embarked upon a great invasion of Parthia. And this extended Rome's frontier to its greatest extent. Between the conquest that Trajan made across the Danube and the Dacia, and in the east, Rome reached its absolute maximum extent. He also managed to inflict mortal damage on the Parthians. Within a couple of generations, they were overthrown by a group called the Sasanians. Trajan, in addition to being a great conqueror, was also one of the greatest builders of the emperors. He built a forum, market, and column in Rome itself. And Trajan's column is particularly significant because it is one of the most important sources that we have in terms of visual sources on how Roman troops dressed, how they built things, and also how Trajan went about the hard work of conquering Dacia. When Hadrian came to power in 117, he reversed course from what his cousin Trajan had been doing. Unlike Trajan, Hadrian had no interest in conquest, but instead was focused on defense. He wanted to make sure that the empire's borders were as defensible and feasible as possible. So he ends up withdrawing from many of Trajan's conquests, especially in the east. The most famous example of Trajan's consolidation of the Roman frontier occurred in Britain. Here he built Hadrian's Wall across the entire extent of Britain. He actually withdrew from parts of Scotland that Trajan had occupied and instead settled on a shorter line and built a more impressive fortification made out of stone with many forts within it, and something that would prove to be a very viable fortification, much more defensible than the Antonine Wall further north. Hadrian was also known for touring the empire, and he had more tours of the empire as a whole than any other emperor. This enabled him to inspect the frontiers and drill his armies on all fronts, but this was an incredibly expensive practice, and that's why no emperors after him really did it. This made him somewhat unpopular, as everywhere he visited, prices shot up because his retinue would consume so much food, wine, and other goods. Although the entire length of Marcus Aurelius's reign is typically included in the Pax Romana, one can make a plausible case that it ought not to be. Marcus Aurelius came to power at a time when Rome was really starting to face major problems for the first time in a long time. During the first half of his reign, he shared power with his half-brother, or adopted brother, and his hope was that his reign would be as peaceful as his adopted father's reign had been. Antoninus Pius had had a pretty easy go of things, all things considered. And at first it appeared that Marcus and Lucius Verus would have similar luck. Marcus would stay in Italy and study for the most part, while his brother would go and deal with problems in the provinces. It was a pretty good arrangement. The problem was that Lucius Verus died in 169 or so, and now Marcus was forced to take on the entire burden of empire by himself. His true passion was actually not governing the empire, but rather philosophy. You can see here that Marcus had a beard. This was not common for Roman emperors or for Romans for most of their history. He was an emperor during the period known as the Second Sophistic, which was a huge upsurge in Greek culture across the Roman Empire. And Marcus was definitely a big part of that. He really fancied himself as an old-timey Greek philosopher. I don't think it's a coincidence that his beard looks a whole lot like Aristotle's. However, during this time, especially after his brother's death, a couple of major crises broke out which would now consume the vast majority of his time. First, there was an invasion by the Marcomanni. The Marcomanni were a Germanic tribe which had put together a major coalition and were now threatening Rome's borders. In particular, Marcus will find himself defending northern Italy on more than one occasion. This would be the first time that he commanded troops in the field, and it would be an immense drain on him. This was something that he only started doing as a middle-aged man. So his workload overnight went from being very low and manageable to being pretty overwhelming. At the same time, there was the Antonine Plague. This was an empire-wide outbreak of smallpox, which killed about 10% or so of the empire's total population. I've seen some estimates, older estimates, that estimated that it was around 33%, but 10% seems to be a more reasonable number. So the combination of these events was difficult to deal with and clearly put a lot of pressure on Marcus. And the reason that we know who's under a lot of stress is because He wrote about it, and we have the book that he wrote. He kept a journal where he wrote about his philosophical musings and the difficulties of maintaining a philosophical outlook while performing the duties of emperor. And that book has become known as the Meditations. He wrote it in Greek, and it is still available to this day. You can buy it in many bookstores in translation. Despite Marcus Aurelius's quest for virtue, his son Commodus had no virtue whatsoever, and also does not seem to have taken an interest in acquiring any. Commodus spent most of his time dressing up like Hercules and killing people in the arena in rigged gladiatorial contests. He was eventually assassinated, and this led to a civil war between 5 generals. If you guessed that this was called the Year of the 5 Emperors, you would be correct. The winner of the contest was Septimius Severus, who then ruled from 193 to 211 and founded the Severan Dynasty. The big takeaway from the Severan Dynasty is that Septimius Severus did not pretend to care about the Senate. Most previous emperors did their utmost to try to adhere to the model of Augustus, to try to just pretend to be another senator who happened to be a little bit more prestigious than the rest. But Septimius Severus had no interest in doing that. He was openly a representative of the armies, and he made no secret about it. He even once advised his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, to reward the soldiers and scorn everyone else. And that's exactly how he governed. It's also worth noting that his heritage is quite interesting. Most previous Roman emperors, in fact all of them, had been from either Italy or from a colony founded by Romans and Italians, so they were descendants of Romans. But Septimius Severus was not ethnically Roman. Latin was not his native language, and neither was Greek. Of all things, he actually was of Carthaginian descent. He grew up in North Africa, and his wife's family was from Syria, and not the parts of Syria that had been settled by the Greeks. So the 2 of them together were not Roman in terms of their cultural heritage. They were Roman by virtue of citizenship, and they were accepted, but neither of them were Latin speakers or people who were culturally in line with the norms of Rome's history. So this was a huge departure from what had come before. After Septimius Severus died, his sons were supposed to govern together, but Caracalla did not want to share power with his brother Geta, so he had him murdered. And in fact, you see here that one of the boy's faces is rubbed out. That is because after he killed his brother, Caracalla went back and made sure that all of the images of the family throughout the empire had Geta's face rubbed out. Caracalla was notoriously cruel, and that was only one of many examples of his cruelty. He also was known to berate different soldiers around him and to be rather harsh on a personal level, but he did something very significant while he was emperor. He extended Roman citizenship to all of the empire's free inhabitants. Before this, there were only areas here and there that would get grants of citizenship, so it had been slowly and sporadically growing, but now Caracalla made everyone a citizen. So this was a very important development, as it really simplified Rome's legal system quite a bit, because now there were only free citizens and slaves, and that was it. Caracalla's personality came back to haunt him. He was actually assassinated by a disaffected soldier while he was on a march on the side of the road trying to urinate. And that soldier acted on behalf of someone who rose up and replaced him. But we're not going to get into those details. Also, if you have the chance, look up a bust of Caracalla as an adult, and you will see that he looks exactly like Gaston from Beauty and the Beast. That's something that's important that you need to do. In the wake of Caracalla's death, there was a good deal of turmoil, and no satisfactory candidates for emperor really presented themselves. Into this void, the women of the Severan family presented the soldiers with the option of retaining the dynasty, but switching to the Syrian side of things, and going with Elagabalus, the next oldest male in the family. Elagabalus was 14, and effectively his grandmother and mother promised that they would make sure that he did the right thing and that they would cooperate with the wishes of the soldiers. Ultimately, this view prevailed and the family moved to Rome. The problem is that Elagabalus was someone who really stuck out like a sore thumb in Rome. Now, while Septimius Severus was someone who was a little bit exotic, he was very much a soldier. And because of that, he fit in fairly well with Rome's troops. He was a very serious, duty-bound man. Elagabalus, however, really didn't click with the Roman Senate. His reign was a complete and total disaster. He frequently held orgies, which I guess isn't that surprising given that you have a 14-year-old emperor who now has a bunch of power and access to as many women as he wants. I mean, what else do you expect to happen, honestly? But also, more to the point, the thing that he really did, which angered and alienated the Senate, is that he wanted to promote his cult of Elagabal at the expense of Rome's traditional religious establishment. He wanted to go into the Roman pantheon and replace Jupiter as the head of the pantheon with Elagabal. And for the Romans, this was blasphemy of the highest order. In general, they were very tolerant of other religions, but this was going way too far because it threatened to completely upset the apple cart of their entire religious order. Because of this, the Senate became horrified, and most of Elagabalus' own troops also were becoming very weary of him. He had a younger cousin, and as it became apparent that plenty of people were angry with him, Elagabalus tried to blame his young cousin for treasonous intentions and tried to persuade his soldiers to murder his cousin, but instead the soldiers decided that they'd be better off with the cousin in charge, so they killed Elagabalus. Elagabalus' body was thrown into the Tiber. His cousin, Severus Alexander, learned the lesson of Elagabalus pretty well. Rather than sticking out, he did his utmost to blend in and assimilate. Severus Alexander was someone who tried his utmost to adhere to the traditions of Augustus. So he actually went away from the policy of Septimius Severus and also tried to cultivate the Senate. He did a pretty decent job overall. He lacked some charisma and he wasn't a military genius, but he did okay. The big mistake that he made is that after years of the army being kissed up to by the emperors, he became a little bit cooler towards them, comparatively speaking. And when he decided that it would be cheaper to bribe a group not to attack Rome rather than to fight a war, the troops took that as an insult to their valor, that he didn't believe in their ability to win the war. And because of that, they actually mutinied and killed him. And in the year 235, when he died, he didn't have an heir, and so one of his generals declared himself emperor. From that point until 284, Rome would be in near constant chaos. They would be in the greatest legitimacy crisis in their history, and that will be the story of our next lecture, how the Romans got through that legitimacy crisis and moved forward.